You're listening to an audio presentation of a Theology Day event created by St. John's Graduate School of Theology and Seminary.
I would like to begin with a prayer, an opening prayer. And the theme of this prayer is inner freedom, interior freedom. And this is one of the biggest themes in spiritual direction as far as what is the goal of spiritual direction, that we can become more interiorly free to say yes to God's invitation to relationship and yes to what God calls us to in the circumstances of our life. So I want to begin with a short prayer for inner freedom. So God desires inner freedom for us. God wants us to be our true selves, joyous, aware, and living each moment to the fullest. God desires inner freedom for us. To see ourselves through the loving eyes of God. To accept loving relationships. To grow in friendship with Jesus. To follow the promptings of the Holy Spirit. To respond open-heartedly to God's invitation. To enter into a right relationship with all of God's creation. To become disciples. And for these graces, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So just a little bit more about myself. Actually, what Grace mentioned about going to Creighton University really followed having been trained in spiritual direction at the monastery next door, at St. Benedict's Monastery, because they used to have a 4-year internship, 2 years of love in class and 2 years of practicum of trying spiritual direction as a student director. So that was my first experience, very much rooted in the Benedictine tradition. And then I joke with my students that I needed remedial work, so I went to Creighton then. But actually, it was wonderful because the first was so rooted in the Benedictine tradition, which is near and dear to my heart as an oblate of that monastery. And the second one, of course, Creighton is a Jesuit university, so it's very Ignatian. And a lot of people think that those two traditions are like oil and water, and they do not mix. And I would say I do not agree about that at all, because both of them are so firmly rooted in our human experience, and that is where we encounter God. And for Benedictines, of course, community life is their major, sometimes I say it's the major spiritual discipline, the major form of asceticism for Benedictines, living together and finding God in that lived life together. And St. Ignatius also talked about it's in our experience when we stay aware and awake to our experience that God is speaking to us right there. So interesting combination of the two there. And then I had wonderful mentors at St. Benedict's Monastery, Sister Josue Bainan and Sister Kate Casper, and I continue to work with the sisters at the Spirituality Center. One of the real strong points of our program is our practicum year. Our students, when they do a graduate certificate in spiritual direction, have an 8-month-long practicum where they are working with directees as a student director. And the sisters offer the supervision and the guidance that makes all the difference for our program. In fact, I was just speaking to somebody who's connected with a different program who said, your practicum year is so good and so grounded. I think our program needs to pay attention. So that's good to know. So I'm very grounded in that Benedictine experience, but then had a wonderful experience with Creighton University. In fact, my instructor for the pre-practicum class, the big class we took before we did our internship, was Maureen Conroy, and we will have some material from her later on. And she's what we might call a big cheese. She would laugh if I said that in the area of spiritual direction. In fact, she was such a big name, and she's an author of many books, and she's at her own spirituality center in New Jersey. In the class, we ended up with an odd number of students, and I got assigned to be her partner for prayer sharing, and it was like, oh, shoot, I've got the teacher. Oh no, I'm going to be so nervous. And she was very human. She was wonderful. So it's a great experience. I already forgot that I have slides. So you were supposed to see that picture. And actually, if you notice at the top, we even have a combined logo for the two, because the program here at St. John's University, even though St. John's awards the credits, is a collaboration between the graduate school and the sisters at St. Benedict, which is really unique to have that really solid academic study along with the art and skills of spiritual direction. So that's where those are both up there. So now I want to show a little cartoon, and then I will make a confession. So an old confessional box, we have ways of making you talk. And this also relates to spiritual direction, since it's so much about the directee sharing. But a confession I want to make is right at the beginning. I feel awkward often with teaching what I teach, because people might think that I'm very accomplished in it. And I want to tell you that in a previous life, I was a math teacher, as some of you know. I was a math teacher, and I think I was a good math teacher because I'm not a math whiz. When I taught statistics to high school students, I really had a sense for where they'd have hard times, where the concepts would be tough. And I think that made me a better teacher in the classroom rather than just being a brilliant mathematician. And so what I say, and I say this, and some of you have been in my prayer and discernment class, I think I can put together a good package for learning when it comes to these topics in spirituality, such as discernment, spiritual direction, because I don't find it easy. I don't find discernment necessarily easy at all. I don't find spiritual direction just easy. It's not something I've accomplished or whatever. And I think that really leads into being able to talk about it with people. So hopefully you will find this beneficial today, both in terms of learning about spiritual direction, but also relating to our lived spirituality every day of our lives, because that is what it's really about. So one thing I wanted to say about our program is that, and this is for all spiritual direction programs, so I'll just go back one. They actually have an interesting statistic, and that is, at one point somebody looked at spiritual direction programs throughout the United States, and there are many, many different kinds. There's no standard by which everybody has to follow. But they said that something like 70% of the people that complete spiritual direction training never formally are spiritual directors. They never do the formal thing of meeting with somebody once a month and saying, I'm a spiritual director. And yet the interesting thing is, you could say, well, what a waste of all that training. But nobody who's been through the training ever says that, because it is so personally formative to go through the training. It really, because our own spiritual growth is so essential if we are going to companion another person. And I even think that if we just straight on head for trying to accomplish our own spiritual growth somehow, one more thing on our to-do list, it's going to fail. But when we do it for the sake of being present to somebody else, that's when there are really deep rewards for us. So we always say that the spiritual direction program is really, it's a formation program. They all are. And it's done in service to the absent other, meaning we're in formation for the sake of those we accompany. So it's kind of an interesting little factoid about how few people actually end up using it. So let's go to a little background on spiritual direction. I'm not going to try and do a history of it or anything like that, but let's look at some of the themes that are still with us going way back into the past. In fact, if you look at this here and the date there, we're talking about the very early centuries of the church. And I am taking Amma Syncletica of Alexandria as an example. And she was one of the Ammas, there were Ammas and Abbas, mothers and fathers of the desert, who was very wise, and people would come to her for advice and really for early spiritual direction. But to emphasize that personal formation piece, I think what she had to say here is very important. Oh, by the way, I want to tell you, you have notes. Some of you have found it. You have notes in your folder. Whenever there is something printed on a slide, it's also on a document in your folder, because it always makes me very sad if I'm teaching a class and somebody's trying really hard to copy down everything. So it's there, and you can make other comments if you want. So this is what she said. It is dangerous for anyone to teach who has not first been trained in the practical life. So it's not just about being holy in some ethereal, unworldly way. For if someone who owns a ruined house receives guests there, he does them harm because of the dilapidation of his dwelling. So this is emphasizing that a kind of self-knowledge grounded in the life we live, how that is just absolutely foundational for spiritual direction. And that self-knowledge continues to be a theme throughout. And then picking up on this, just to underscore this, and here calling it radical self-honesty, here is a quote from Columbus Stewart from the Abbey here, with an article that he wrote on the Desert Fathers on radical self-honesty. And this really explicitly connects that self-honesty with the choice to talk honestly with somebody else. Because he says, is there something about sharing the secret of one's heart with another person which liberates in a way that solitary confession and prayer does not? And you know, if you think about our whole idea of what church is and so on, we are just not saved as individuals. It's not just a me and God thing, forget everybody else. But we are in this together, and there is something incredible that happens when we share with another, and a kind of honesty that comes forth that's different than if we're just thinking within ourselves. So that's one of the initial prompts for why the practice of spiritual direction began in the Christian church. And then, going ahead in time a little bit, let's go to Benedict, and here's the statue of Benedict in the courtyard here at St. John's. In the rule of Benedict, there is something called manifestation of thoughts to another, and here's just a little paraphrase. Manifestation of thoughts to a trusted spiritual guide is one of the tools for good works. It's interesting. It falls in that part of the rule which talks about the good works we do for the sake of, for ourselves, for others, for the community that we are in. And the interesting thing to what is being underscored here that adds a little bit to what we saw in the previous two slides is that it's not a matter of already having made a decision on our own, let's say, if we're discerning something and bringing it to somebody, but you just let the person who's companioning you know what is occupying your thoughts, your prayers, what is happening, and really being willing to put that out there and then sort through that together. So Benedict was also big on this practice of companioning. And of course, one of the things that we really benefit from, although we need to understand the word anew, is that we can grow in humility through this practice. And what I want to say is one way we could talk about humility in modern language so that we don't just think of hair shirts and flagellating ourselves and all of that. But humility is being comfortable in your own skin, being comfortable as far as being a creature of our loving God, being created by our loving God. So I have a quote here from Michael Casey, who's an Australian Cistercian. I like to say he's just a strict Benedictine. And he's going to be here this coming summer. We have a monastic, Grace, what do we call that again? Monastic Institute. And it's on humility, and we have an incredible lineup of 3 people. 2 I can remember right now. And I think it's the last week of June, just going a little bit into July, if I remember. And Michael Casey will be here from Australia, and he's an incredible author. So I imagine he's a great speaker. And also Father Luke Dysinger, from California will be here, and he also is an incredible author. If you ever want to check out his website, so many resources. And the whole topic is humility. And humility, understanding humility as an invitation, a really great gift for us to be comfortable with being creatures of our God. So this is kind of typical, these two little quotes I have from Michael Casey. He says, as humble persons, we accept both our gifts and our limitations. The fruit of humility is naturalness, being ourselves in grace. So just think about that. How comfortable would it be if we could just be ourselves in grace, which means being ourselves in the presence of our God who loves us. So self-honesty has its harsh side, you could say. Sometimes we see things we don't like, but it also, and this is the humility, is not only the harsh part, but also accepting our humanity. So this all kind of then comes to a head with this very short quote from the prologue of St. Benedict, which is often quoted, that all of this is inviting us to listen with the ear of the heart. The first time I heard that, I think it was with Sister Kate and Sister Joshua, I thought, that is just really weird. But it is a wonderful, wonderful quote. It kind of wakes you up. Listen with the ear of the heart. So what I want to emphasize is that the hunger for spiritual direction is not new. People have been hungry to be companioned this way since the very beginning, and people have arisen who are willing to do the companioning. I know Sister Josway in our internship, I remember she'd talk about, can you imagine what this world would be like if everybody felt there was a place where they were really listened to? And actually, that's something to get used to in spiritual direction. And first, and many of you are already in spiritual direction, you go and the whole hour, it's all about me. And at first, it's sort of like, ooh, this is uncomfortable. But then you realize you have this person who's gazing upon you with love and listening to everything you say. What a difference that makes. And this hunger for that kind of listening has been here since the beginning. And then another quote from the Rule of Benedict further on is, we believe that the divine presence is everywhere. And so I'll tell you right now, in modern spiritual direction, people do not talk just about their prayer life. And there are some spiritual directors who think that's absolutely the only thing you should talk about during spiritual direction. But of course, you talk about the life that you live and how are you living out God's invitation in the very circumstances of the life that you live every day. And where do you notice God's presence? So the divine presence is everywhere. So let's move on. You've heard me talk long enough. What do they say, like 12 minutes? And then people shut off. No, it was because of commercials on TV, although I think they're more frequent than that now. Yeah, especially towards the end of the show. But anyway, but they say people are sort of timed that way. So what we'll do is we will stop frequently and have some interaction. And that's what I'd like to do now, because I want to ask, what is spiritual direction? And I don't want to just go ahead and answer it. What I would like to do is present you with an example of spiritual direction in practice, and then have you talk together about what you notice, what is going on here. Now, the interesting thing is in spiritual direction, nobody ever observes the spiritual direction. I was in training as a teacher since I was a high school teacher, and we get observed all the time before you get your license, every year by the principal and all that. So somebody watches how you're doing in the classroom. We never do that, and even during the practicum year, nobody ever sits in. We never have a one-way mirror or something and watches the student doing spiritual direction. We do have other ways of reflecting on how things are going. So the tough thing is, so what if I want to show an example? That's kind of hard to do, except luckily, and I love searching for things on Google. It's amazing what you can find. I found a little example that was put together, and I'd say both of the people in this role play are spiritual directors themselves. And they've set up a situation, and one of them is playing the part of being the spiritual director, and the other is playing the part of being the directee. And they do a really nice job with it. And it's short, too. We're not going to listen to an hour session. In fact, it's a little less than 5 minutes. So I'm going to show it to you, and here it is. I'm going to show it to you, and afterwards, I'm going to ask you to talk at your tables. And first, if you could introduce yourselves, if you don't know each other yet, and I'll repeat this later. And then I'm going to ask you to note what was going on. What did you see in this interaction? And so in this case, the man is going to be playing the role of the spiritual director, and the woman is the directee, even though I am quite sure that they are both directors who are doing this. And it is from us, I think they are both from the Ignatian tradition, but that doesn't make any difference. This would be very much what you would see in just a spiritual direction session over at the monastery or something like that. Okay, so let's make sure. I'm going to fast forward it a little bit. Here we go.
No, I was deeply moved by their hospitality.
Yeah.
And their freeness.
I'm just going to stop. I should have said the situation is she's been on a mission trip to Nicaragua, and now she's coming back and she's processing that with her spiritual director.
Even in the midst of so much poverty.
Yeah. That's interesting. I'm sensing a lot of feelings in you about Pedro and these people and what they're going through and how it is affecting you.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit more about those feelings, about what you've been feeling. Can you do that?
Yes, well, as I say, I go through my day now. I'm back in my busy world, in my 9 to 5, back here, and they're miles and miles away. And I'm thinking, like, while I was there, I knew how to help them. Pick up the hammer and do something practical, and I'm helping them, and also sharing in good company and so on. Now I'm back, and that experience is over, and I'm walking around, and I'm thinking about little Pedro and what his life will become. And I am thinking about how to help, being so far away. And you know what else it's like? It's like I don't want it to be over. It's not like a began and ended. That little boy's life still continues. And even though I'm thousands of miles away, I don't want to walk away.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. How does that make you feel? That you can't do anything right now, huh? Is that right?
Yeah, it feels good to talk about it.
I bet.
Not too many people that I can talk on this level about.
Yeah.
But it also makes me, I feel like I'm searching, or I'm just trying to, figure out a way where I can, continue to help.
A lot of desire there, huh?
Yes, I would say so.
Desire.
I
Yeah.
would say so. Especially Pedro, he's made a very big impact. Here I was going down to help them.
Yeah.
and I did.
Yeah.
In a very little way, but I did. And I'm so happy that I went. And you know what? That little boy has impacted me. And I don't really know totally how yet.
Yeah.
And I want to spend time.
What I'm hearing, what I'm feeling is over here. What I'm hearing you talking about your feelings, your desires, and how all that is, a joyfulness. But yet there's a certain little underlying thing that you want to do something, feel like you can't. And have you ever told God anything about this? Have you ever talked to God about this?
Well, I've talked to God about the family.
Yeah.
And I've asked God to continue to watch over little Pedro. I've done that.
Have you told God about how you feel and your desires and all of this?
No, I don't think I have.
Oh.
Doesn't God know how I feel?
God does know how you feel, yeah. But what's interesting is that when you have a relationship with a person, two people walking along a moonlit shore, and they see the beauty. They both see it, they both know it, but that somehow you want to tell the other person about that, to grow in your own love and intimacy. Do you think maybe that would be something you could do with God, or helpful? What kind of a relationship would it be, do you think, if you never told the other what you're feeling, even though the other person may already know in some way?
Well, that would be very one-sided, and that would be kind of boring.
Kind of boring relationship,
I
right?
think.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's like that with God?
Well, what do you think?
Well, that's different.
Would you want to find out a little bit?
I would like to find out.
Yeah. So why don't you, next time, between now and the next time we meet, why don't you just go to you?
I think Dad had to be away a lot. He's trying to,
shoot.
bring money home
Yeah.
to the family.
So sorry. Much more sensitive computer than mine at home.
A little bit?
I would like to find out.
Yeah. So why don't you, next time, between now and the next time we meet, why don't you just go to your room and put a chair down and you sit across from God and just tell him what your feelings, your desires, what's going on, and see if there's some back and forth on that level. How's that sound? Will you be
Sounds
able to
very
do
good.
that? Yeah.
That sounds very, very good.
Good.
That sounds right on.
Okay, good. Well, let's see if we can arrange another date. Okay?
Great.
God
Back
bless
in-
you.
Okay, we will stop there. There you saw a little snippet of what's involved with spiritual direction. So I would ask you at your table, please introduce yourselves, and then I'd like you to talk about, if this is an example of spiritual direction, what did it tell you about spiritual direction? What did you learn about spiritual direction as shown in this little clip? Okay? Okay, let's come back to the whole group, and Grace will walk around with the mic. And let's just leave it wide open, related to this question of what is spiritual direction and what you saw here. Let's leave it wide open for both just observations and then questions if you have that. So just raise your hand and Grace will come over. She's going to get her steps in this way today with the mic so everybody can hear the questions. Or what you saw. What really stood out to you? What kind of impression did this video make?
I think what we chatted about
Here.
a little bit.
Okay, here comes the mic.
Oh.
Oh, yeah, because some people won't be able to hear. Yeah.
Anyway, what we were chatting quite a bit about in terms of what we saw is that the spiritual director seemed like his main interest was in soliciting questions, good questions, and listening. In other words, trying to bring out the feelings, the desires, those kinds of things, and not so much preaching himself or doing a lot of direction kinds of things. But there as kind of a listener. That's kind of what we were talking about in terms of what the spiritual director's role was there. And quite interesting that we, in all of our lives, I guess we can also be good listeners. Not that we're spiritually directing anybody,
Yeah.
but just no matter what we're talking about is that we're good listeners.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that, first of all, that is the reason that many people prefer using the word spiritual companioning or something else rather than spiritual direction, because it can get confused with the idea of almost like mentoring somebody in, X, Y, and Z that they need to do in order to grow spiritually. But the emphasis is more on the listening and eliciting, and it's still encouraging the person and drawing them towards something new and different, but through listening. And in this case, you could hear how he was trying to ask open questions that would lead her to explore her experience more deeply, for her experience of God. So yeah.
One of the concerns I had was that a definition would really be helpful. I'm finding increasingly when I talk to people, particularly young people, often the remark is that I'm not really a religious person, I am a spiritual person. And that's a very nebulous sort of abstract term for people. And some of this
You need to hold the mic
okay.
closer. Yeah.
Some of this reminds me of the 1970s Rogerian therapy. I hear what you're saying. Are you saying? It's not that there isn't substantial utility in psychology coming into spirituality here, but when I talk to people, sometimes when they talk about spirituality, it might be along a continuum where there's this personal encounter, this personal relationship with God that needs to develop. The other end of the continuum having to do with perhaps social justice issues that move me, and like when this woman was talking about, I just came back from Nicaragua, and I moved by the poverty and that, and so I just wonder if you could comment on that a little bit.
Well, first let's start with Rogerian therapy in the 70s. There are listening techniques that you will hear, you could call them techniques, across the board in so many different situations, where instead of jumping in, you try and elicit from the other person. So certainly in spiritual direction, we do use active listening techniques, but you are never just a passive just mirror, because you're always, a spiritual director is always noticing where is the warmth, where is the energy, where is God coming through in that experience, and we highlight those things that would kind of lead in that direction. A classic example, well, we could just do like up here. Rather than what we saw the spiritual director do in that example, suppose he had asked a question about, so where did you stay when you were down in Nicaragua, and who arranged this trip for you and all that? You could be down this rabbit hole of information and all that, but it is questions and so on that bring out their experience more, specifically listening for God in their experience. So that is similar in terms of the active listening. In fact, we'll see an example of active listening and how powerful it is, and what you'll see will be from a business example. But then the next thing about spiritual and not religious, all kinds of people come to spiritual direction. And we will look at a definition in just a minute of spiritual direction. All kinds of people come to spiritual direction, and they do not have to be a member of a Christian church or whatever. I'll say, first of all, having said Christian church, my personal opinion is that it's hard to do spiritual direction outside of your own faith. It's not a problem ecumenically, like I have had Lutherans that I companion, and I'm Roman Catholic, brought up Methodist, and that's all okay. But as far as like me with somebody who is Jewish or somebody Buddhist companioning me, that would be hard. So usually usually there has to be compatibility between the director and the directee, and we'll talk more about what to look for in a director later on. But somebody does not have to be a card-carrying member of a church. They do need to be truly desiring a closer relationship with God. And that means they're not coming to you to fix their life problems. They're not coming to you for psychological work. They're coming because they want to grow closer to God. So they can be spiritual without being religious in the sense of institutional affiliation. Yeah, so it's kind of wide open. But a director has to be, if you're not comfortable companioning somebody who is not going to church every Sunday, you need to be aware of that and either work on that or not see people that are spiritual but not religious. Yeah.
I noticed that in contrast to asking for information that you just talked about, that he stayed with her in terms of the question, have you talked to God?
Yeah.
I mean, you talk about what was a warm moment or energy one. I thought that was one, and I like that terminology for it, that he knew there was something there, and it was a new concept, and she needed some time. And so he just found different ways of weaving around that to stay with it. Didn't take off from it, stayed with her, and just kept opening it up farther and farther.
And how rare it is that we just stay with our experience. So to have somebody help us do that, really, it matters a lot. And I think he was also in addition to her words, he was also reading her body language and her facial expression. Because sometimes in a direction session, I'll say, something just went, your face just, something went across, something's going on there. You notice the nonverbals too, and so you help them stay with that. Yeah. Because usually we're on to the next thing, at least if you're like me, what's the next thing I've got to do? Somebody else, observations or questions that this brought up?
It seemed like...
Here, let's get the mic over here.
It seemed like she didn't necessarily want to go where he was leading her. She kept going away back to where she was, that he had to keep pulling her back away from her, I'm concerned or whatever.
Yeah.
And he had to zero in on what was really there. So that was...
It's very good, and that's a perfect example, here, Grace, that's a perfect example of how it's not just a neutral, reflect everything back to the person, there's kind of a goal. Or even think of somebody I just saw recently, and the shoulds are really big. I should be praying this way. How do I should, blah, 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 and I just kept bringing back, did you notice that what you're just talking about right there, that is really prayer. You are really, there was a practice this person had. So we do have, there is something we're listening for, right? Right, that's very good, and he did that.
I was just wanting to say, I guess I found a connection with, are you familiar with the book, The 5 Kinds of Love?
Mm-hmm.
Because for some reason that came to mind for me, the whole idea that maybe for some people it's through gifts and through others it's through spending time together, but also the affirmation, or when you are affirmed, and maybe that's the thing that spiritual direction can help one with, is to, and so maybe it depends on what kind of person you are, personality, but so that was just I guess good to understand that, but then also this whole thing of just being afraid to share your feelings. So it was very well displayed, so I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, what you said highlights there are individual differences. We all have different spirituality styles, and the nature of our relationship with God can be different depending on who we are. And a spiritual director does need to be open to that if they're going to do this ministry. And it is affirming, because in the end, I just say, it's like your director just gazes upon you with love, this affirming love, and it makes a huge difference. Yes?
I just wanted to say that at our table, 2 people mentioned the Befriender program and how important that is in parishes.
And that's a good example of the kind of formation that goes into becoming a spiritual director. You can do it in so many different ways. I felt I even listened to my students differently after I did the first training. Yeah, every day. Anyone else? Or okay.
I also saw a great deal of what's the word? It's very much like Worldwide Marriage Encounter, where feelings are the ticket to the heart, and sharing the feelings, and the idea of not being alone. You have a companion, and if you're sharing your feelings and being real with one another, you're almost helping each other grow spiritually.
Yeah,
and directing each other. So a lot of marriage encounter.
That's a neat connection. I could see what you're saying exactly. And there is an emphasis on feelings, and I would say that's especially for 2 reasons. One is that we just let our feelings take over and we just react. They take over, but we don't reflect on them enough, so that helps. And feelings are so important because they get right to the heart. And the other thing is that thoughts are never just thoughts. I know there are people that think there are times they go into rational mode and they are just absolutely being rational, intellectual, and there's no emotion. You could think of all sorts of meetings you go to like that, and that is never, never true, because there are these little writers attached to thoughts, and those are feelings. And so we give more attention to that, so we become more aware, so they don't just knock us over and control us. Yeah, because they are a way to the heart when we are aware.
The last discussion about feelings brings up a question for me, and that is, how do you connect that with God in my life? I mean, we are connecting with counseling, but I can talk lots and lots about feeling, but not make a connection with God. And I noticed that the director here, the companion, really did a good job on pulling that in. And one question I'm allergic to is, well, where's God in this experience? That seems to be the trump card. If you don't know what to say, I say, where's God in this? It's true, but it's mainly, my main question is, how do you not stay with the feelings that it's in building that relationship with God?
Yeah. You know, it's funny, I share, and I know Sister Mary from I share that same allergy to that question about, so where's God in this? Okay, so we go right away to our head, and we try and come up with the right answer, because we kind of feeling like we're being checked. Like, did we find God? It's kind of like, where's Waldo? Did you find God in the right place there? And so that is a problem. So I think the thing, and this gets into a bigger topic on discernment, we work with feelings, but I think we help directees come to notice the different qualities of feelings. And if we have one person that's been in the prayer and discernment class, we talk about, you notice the different quality of feelings that are leading us toward God, in terms of there's just a whole different quality. They're usually not urgent and pushing us. They have all sorts of qualities that tell us this is something real and grounded. And then we have feelings that make us very agitated and make us just want to get up and take care of things or whatever it is. And we go, whoa, I think those feelings are not taking me towards God. So we have to realize we have a mix of stuff going on inside that way. So we can kind of help a directee with that, or the director can listen, and their listening can help follow those feelings that are really moving towards God. Yeah, good question. Well, are you all waiting for the right answer? I should have told you earlier, there is a right answer. Yeah, there is. Okay, so what we'll look at is a classic definition from William Barry and William Connolly, a book, The Practice of Spiritual Direction, which has been around forever. Might have even been late 70s. It was written in the early 80s. And this is just such a good definition. And even before we begin to read the definition, this picture, you'll find it online if you look for spiritual direction images. And it's a wonderful embodiment of the fact that you have a director and a directee meeting, but always in the presence of God, that third person who is there. Because God is the real director. If we ever think we're in charge of somebody else's spiritual life or whatever, there's a lot of hubris, a lot of lack of humility in that, because God is the real director. So that's where the third chair comes in. So here's the definition. I've shortened it a little bit, but this is the crux of it. Christian spiritual direction enables the directee to pay attention to God's personal communication, to respond to this personally communicating God, to grow in intimacy with this God, and to live out the consequences of that relationship. So I wonder, any comments on that? It's kind of where we're coming from as far as this talk today. If you're going to say, and certainly there can be different kinds of spiritual direction. And there's even things called soul shepherding, that's more on the Protestant side. And there can be all sorts of different things, but this is the kind of spiritual direction that I'm talking about. Any questions or comments on that?
At the Spirituality Center at St. Ben's, there is, over the desk, a picture of the three.
Oh, the icon of the, yes. the Trinity, the Holy Three, yes. And that's such a good thing to bring up because spiritual direction is fundamentally very Trinitarian. If we believe God within God's self is relationship and the energy of that relationship within God's self, and that spills out into love and connection with all of creation, that relates then to why relationship is so important in spiritual direction. And even that relationship with God mirrored between the directee and the director. So yes, that's a wonderful icon to keep in mind. I think I might have it on a slide later on here. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, then I'm just going to look at here, what do you talk about? Just a couple things from spiritual direction, because people wonder about that, especially when you begin spiritual direction the first time. Like I said, I do know there are directors that say you only talk about your prayer life, you don't talk about anything else. But no, this is usually how it goes. You do talk about your prayer life and how you notice God's presence in your daily life experiences. And then you do talk about areas in your life where you wish to do some discerning, where you seek a greater sense of peace, of inner freedom. And that's again where seeking that sense of peace or that sense of inner freedom, we're talking about something that's very affective, not just thoughts about that. Yeah. So what I'd like to do is then talk about some, in math we would have proofs and counterproofs. So here we have counterproof. Every so often I try and make a connection between math and spiritual direction. The worst was in the first time I taught the prayer and discernment class, and we were talking about the direction that feelings take us in terms of consolation, desolation, towards God, away from God. And I said, well, it's kind of like a vector. There's a direction and a magnitude to it. And the class is like, huh? And one of the monks laughed because he was a math major as undergraduate. Okay, but anyway, so we're going to look at this is the counterproof, what it is not. So I'm going to give you a couple scenarios because spiritual direction is not advice giving or teaching. Let me say advice giving and teaching have their role in our lives. Hopefully we have people we can talk to and we can trust and get advice from. Hopefully we have places we can go and be taught. But that is not in spiritual direction. Can we just preserve this 1 hour a month, which is kind of the typical thing, for deep listening. Listening, I think a director helps the person listen to themselves deeply and also to listen to God. So that's why I'm not dissing advice and teaching at all. Those are very important. But can we just have one place where there's just deep listening and it doesn't get complicated with that other stuff? So here's some counterexamples. And we often talk about there's this working alliance between the spiritual director, spiritual director and the directee, meaning they both know, and we looked at that definition, that they are there to really help foster a deeper relationship with God. So here's some examples when the working alliance is lost. And actually, I think I take these from Sister Kate Casper. Oh, no, we're going to get to that in just a little bit. From Sister Kate Casper with the internship that I went through. So they're a little funny, but it makes a point. So let's suppose, and she calls this a helpee and a helper instead of a directee and a director. Because then we have to think, is this spiritual direction? And this could happen in spiritual direction, but helpee, I've got to talk to you about my marriage. I don't think I can take it anymore. Helper, what's going on? Helpee, he's getting mean. It's probably all my fault, but I really don't think I can take it any longer. I'm thinking of asking for a divorce. Helper, I think you're rushing things. A marriage is forever. Ask God to help you see how you can do better in your marriage. Now, that would not necessarily be helpful in the way that some deep listening through all of that could have been. So that would not be spiritual direction. That might easily happen between two friends, but okay. And then the next one, another scenario, the helper says, you're having trouble believing that God is good when there is so much suffering and evil in the world. Okay, that's fine. Helpy, that's right. I just can't understand why all these terrible things happen to people. I just can't pray anymore. Helper, I have a great book you could read. It talks about just this kind of thing. I can loan it to you, and then we could discuss it. Okay, that might be an example of teaching, and it might be helpful, but it's not spiritual direction. Actually, sometimes many spiritual directors, if there's something like a book or something that might be helpful, if that comes up and you kind of put that aside in your mind during the session, might be at the end when after you said the final prayer and you're setting the next date, you might say, by the way, if you ever want to think about it, you might feel that it was okay just to offer a gentle suggestion, but we don't do that right in a session for sure. So spiritual direction isn't that kind of advice giving, and it isn't that kind of teaching. And it's also, we often talk about, it's not about fixing the directee, because we always want to be helpful and fix people. So I have a humorous video here. My students in spiritual direction really enjoy this. It's going to be a short little role play again, so it's not actual session, and you can laugh out loud because it's meant to be funny. Sometimes I have to give students permission, like in high school. No, okay. So, but it is meant to be funny, but it's very insightful about pointing out that we don't fix it, but also with a humorous note. This is from this video was made by a church group that was doing group spiritual direction, which is a related topic. We won't really go into that today, but they all have been part of group spiritual direction, and then they made this YouTube. Okay, there we go. And this one we'll watch all the way through. I don't need to fast forward or anything.
I'm Jenny Schultz, and I've been in group spiritual direction for several years.
I'm Marcy Shai, and I've been part of group spiritual direction for just 1 year. Well, when I started, I thought, how is this going to work?
The way it works is we meet once a month in small groups, and one person shares at a time. And you can share a joy, a struggle, anything that's been on your mind.
It's just, there's all this pressure, And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me. I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, it's not about fixing each other. It's about listening for where God is working in your life. It's about taking time and being quiet from our busy lives and just listening.
There's this achy, I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. All of them.
Yeah, that sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you.
It is really powerful to feel like you've been heard, and especially when you know that someone has listened to you without judgment and without trying to fix you or give you advice.
And I just have been so delighted about how much I've learned from just listening to other women and just listening for how God is working in their life and thinking then later how He's working in my life as well.
Okay, so come join us, they say. So every single person there, nobody was a director. They're kind of peers within their group, and then they made this funny video. Any comments or?
What kind of nail was that?
Yeah, really. It was pretty convincing. Yeah, it looked like it had to be, really. It's huge. I do want to say one thing. And one reason why it's good to laugh about there being this rule, like you're not fixing it. If a director is seeing somebody and they obviously have problems, say, with chronic depression, or there's an addiction that's going on, or something like that, there are times when we will refer and say, you need to get some help, some counseling. And we might say, please go and work on that for a while and then come back, or do it parallel with. So there are times when it's like a nail in the forehead, but there's a condition that needs to be dealt with. And that's a whole other topic, but it's a big thing we talk about. How do you notice times where they need to be referred? And we need to be really clear as spiritual directors, we are not psychological counselors. And that would be terribly wrong to try to go into that area. But generally, but not fixing. So I think it's time for a break, and then we will come back and start looking at the theological assumptions of spiritual direction. Doesn't that sound exciting? Sounds so academic. It actually relates to the little booklet that's in your folder. So, okay. So let's take about 10 minutes or so, Grace, or how long? Okay. So about quarter after, we'll be back. Okay, let's return to tables then. And I have just a couple things that came up in conversation that I want to mention. Now, later on, we will talk at the very end about things to watch for, my personal little list of things to look for with a spiritual director. But two things I want to mention. Yes, there is a difference between the sacrament of reconciliation and going to a spiritual director. Because, for one thing, to begin with, a spiritual direction is a long-term relationship. It takes quite a long time till you get to know each other. It goes over a couple years or whatever. And there's a lot of listening. And during that time, you might discern things that you want to bring to confession even. But the sacrament of reconciliation is short-term. It is sacramental. Although I will say, of course, we've all had the experience where we are lucky enough to be in a situation where the priest had time to spend, even if it's just a couple minutes, to kind of talk and listen in sort of a spiritual direction way as part of it. That's kind of an extra benefit that happens sometimes. And we can all think of times like that. But it's different from spiritual direction. So I hope those two things, that makes sense. And the reason it's important to maybe talk about that, there was a time we talked about, say, members of a convent would see a confessor, and it got kind of all mixed up together as far as, because that would be a priest and confession and all that. But so they are different in today's world, and both are very important in terms of the role that they play. The next thing, just to emphasize that, for example, at the School of Theology, we have degrees and we have certificates. Spiritual direction is just one of our certificates. You can do a certificate, it's kind of where you can make up your own program and everything, and you do a short-term study. It's not as big as a degree. So whether it's a degree or a certificate, when you earn it, it's evidence of completion of study. That is what it shows. You have so when our spiritual directors do the graduate certificate in spiritual direction, it is evidence that they have satisfactorily completed the study. It is not evidence that they have the charism to be a spiritual director. That is something else entirely. And also, it is not in any way a certification. That's a whole different kind of thing. So when we say somebody is certified or has certification, that means there's been some agency that gave them the stamp of approval and said, you are now qualified to do what you're supposed to do. Let me give an example. As a teacher, I'd earned my degree. The degree is evidence of having completed the study, but then the state had to step in, and I had to send in all this paperwork and everything, and you have to be approved and licensed where you get that stamp of approval that now you can practice as a teacher, so to speak. There is nothing like that in spiritual direction. There is nothing like that. All you can know is that the person has completed a program of study, whether it's a part of a school like ours, or whether it's like the monastery. When I completed the internship over there, I got a certificate in spiritual direction, which meant I'd completed the requirements of that. But if you ever hear somebody say they are a certified or licensed spiritual director, that should be a red flag. Because the first thing it would tell me, because what I'm talking about right here is common talk among spiritual directors. It is how Spiritual Directors International talks about this, and there is a big organization across faiths and everything. And if somebody starts saying, I'm licensed or I'm a certified director, it makes me think that they're kind of lone rangering it on their own, and they're not really in touch with what's going on with the community of spiritual directors. And being a member of the church and just how we look at community as Christians, it's always good to be part of a community and not lone rangering it, and that is certainly true if you're a spiritual director. So the thing is, they actually have tried with, this is a little funny maybe, they have tried with Spiritual Directors International to come up with what would a program, at minimum, what would a program have to have, and they just were all over the map and they could never agree about that. However, they have agreed, and we will talk later, they do have a code of ethics, which is wonderful for spiritual directors, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So I hope that helps clarify some things. So still in our program, I'll just say, if there are some red flags and somebody really cannot meet the goals of the program in terms of learning to companion other people, we can say no to somebody. That you could call this a certificate, but we're not going to say you have a certificate in spiritual direction. So we do have these goals and so on. They do need to meet it, but it's different than giving somebody a license or something like that. So, okie doke. So now related back to, I forgot to show this, related to that idea about a spiritual direction, maybe you could call it spiritual companioning. This relates to a book that's for sale out in the lobby by Margaret Gunther, who is actually an ordained Episcopal priest. And her book, Holy Listening, is kind of a classic, and she's one that really brought forth this image of a spiritual director as like a midwife. And so this is what she says. The spiritual director is midwife for the soul. The midwife does things with, not to, the person giving birth. She helps the birth giver to ever greater self-knowledge. The midwife assists at a natural event, and if she needs help, she will ask for it. Under her guidance, the birthing is based on sympathetic human contact throughout. So it's a nice image about being a midwife for what's happening, what is happening, which also relates to God is the real director. We're really facilitating that relationship with God. So, okay, so now we are going to move on and apply some of the theological assumptions of spiritual direction. Oh, and here we have a version of that icon of the Trinity. Yeah, there are many, many, many different versions of it. And so I think this is the original by Rubylev from Russia, if I remember. Yeah. So, so in your folders, you have a kind of orangish, burnt orange colored, glossy book. And what it is one of my sons told me, the word for this is content marketing, content advertising, meaning the covers, the shiny covers, are full of information about the program, but the idea is that the inside, the white pages, are things that you might want to keep and look at later on, because what I did is I took these theological assumptions of spiritual direction about what we have certain ideas about God that we're acting on in spiritual direction. And then for each one of those ideas, I've got a reflection, and I call them Benedictine reflections because I count the Psalms as being Benedictine. That's a little imperialistic maybe, but anyway. So, but they're really nice reflections, including, I mentioned Father Luke Dysinger appears twice. At the beginning, he has this excellent discussion of Lectio Divina, how you read sacred scripture, but you can apply that to other inspirational reading, and later on Lectio on life. And by the way, his material is all, he says very clearly, anybody can take it and print it and pass it on. So it's all legal in there. So we're going to talk about these assumptions of spiritual direction. And we're going to take them piece by piece. So the first one, the very first thing we start with is looking at God and who is our God. And that is that God always gives God's self in loving self-communication. God is always offering that communication to us. Before We even talk about prevenient grace, I remember in the Methodist Church. But even before we are aware, and Paul talks about that too in letters, even before we know what we're seeking, God is communicating with us, and we can begin to feel that desire to connect with God. And then related to that is that God, our God, is present in all human experience and can be experienced in all these ways, can be experienced in our hearts, our minds, our imaginations, our psyches, which is our whole psychological self, and our bodies. And if that seems strange about bodies, if you think about liturgy and you think about the movements we do in liturgy and even the gathering together for prayer, that is part of experiencing God very physically, opening ourselves to that. So this is wonderful if we have a God that is always reaching out to us, and in so many different ways, so that we just can't miss the communication, you would think. Then what could possibly get in the way? Well, one of the things we talk about in the discernment class is this very human tendency to do spiritual bypassing. And it's just a great term. Once you've got a name for something, I think sometimes then you can be more sensitive to noticing yourself doing it. And so what is spiritual bypassing? It's the use of spiritual ideas and practices to avoid dealing with painful feelings, unresolved wounds, and developmental needs. And sometimes, especially in central Minnesota, I know some people from the Catholic tradition will talk about the old thing about offer it up to God and it'll just go away. Like you're angry, okay, just offer it up to God. It'll just magically disappear. And that can be a kind of spiritual bypassing, and we don't take the time to know our experience and understand that kind of self-knowledge. And I should say though, the major author, we use him in my classes, is not even from the Christian tradition. So Catholics, Lutherans, Christians in general do not have a corner on this market. He comes from the Buddhist tradition. And he says, people go and they sit on the cushion and I'm just going to bliss out, or I'm just not going to feel anything. No, that's spiritual bypassing. So it's very human, every single religious tradition. It's a temptation. It's a way of avoiding. Let me give an example of spiritual bypassing and then an example of staying with your experience. So here's an example of spiritual bypassing. Whenever I became anxious, I would immediately reach for the nearest inspirational book on my bookshelf. Instead of sitting with the anxiety and checking in to see where it was coming from, I would quickly find refuge in exciting spiritual ideas. So it doesn't have to be prayer. It could be all sorts of ways to bypass. So that's an example of bypassing. Now the next one, in contrast, what would it mean to stay with your experience? And I have to say this comes from a priest who teaches within the contemplative outreach, the centering prayer and so on in Snowmass, Colorado with Father Tom, or did teach with Father Thomas Keating and so on. So this is an example that this person gave of what it would mean to stay with experience. And we can relate to this here. I overhear a heated political discussion. Not hard to do now, right? I'm not even involved in the conversation, but I notice how my stomach clenches up into a knot. I open my awareness to that clenched up feeling as I continue to set up chairs for the meeting. So just to notice and come to know what's going on there. But just the notice part. These are just about, do we choose to notice or do we want to just repress it? After we notice, then there's the process of understanding and then working with that. But so this is something that can get in the way. But one thing, especially from the Benedictine, modern Benedictine tradition, one thing that can help is, what if we looked at our life as a book of sacred scripture And just as we open up Scripture and we read and see what speaks to us in our heart, what if we did that with our life? What if we did Lectio on our life, and as we review things, we listen for where is God speaking to us? So there is this process, Lectio Divina on life. And you've got this written in your notes that you have there in front of you. And this is from Father Luke Dysinger, the Benedictine from California, who'll be here next summer. And he says, we can listen with the ear of our heart to our own memories, noticing God's presence. And noticing in terms of not answering the question so much of where is God in this, but noticing how God moves us with him. And so first we begin with Lectio, begin with some restful silence and review the events of a period of time. There might be you just know there's something you need to reflect on. In the Meditatio, choose a memory that touches the heart, recall the concrete details, and note how God seemed to be present or absent. And then Oratio, offer the experience to God in prayer. And that means, talk with God, like we saw in the spiritual direction example. Can you talk with God about that? And then Contemplatio, simply rest in the presence of God as you finish. So this is a way that can help us stay with our experience rather than bypassing it. And let me stop there. And I wonder if they're just in the whole group. Are there any questions about what the spiritual bypassing means, or about this practice here of Lectio on life as a way to stay with our experience? And we have a microphone again. We'll just have a pop quiz if nobody says anything.
Something you said made me think of this connection of noticing God's presence and where's the movement of the Spirit. I think often I find that people tend to think God is really present when I feel good.
Yeah.
And when it's happy, yeah, and things are resolved. But I also appreciate the advice of paying attention to the resistances, or what I don't want to experience, that God is working there too, maybe especially there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. One of the major things that we work with in classes in the spiritual direction program is we do tend to feel there are acceptable feelings and there are unacceptable feelings. And so God isn't only in the warm fuzzies, but also can be in the really tough stuff too, and to realize that.
I'm just wondering, we've talked a lot about feelings, and so I'm wondering from a spiritual director perspective, what do you do when somebody's just not comfortable even talking about their feelings? They're okay telling you about a story or something that they're struggling with without even wanting to use that word.
Yeah. For one thing, I think you can listen to feelings in so many different ways without making it explicit. But this is important because there are people who are, and you think about Myers-Briggs and where we are on all those tests, there are people who are thinking types, and that's more comfortable. So I think still, the way that you listen as a director maybe changes, and they are less likely to say their feelings explicitly, but it'll be there in the story that they're telling. And so their feelings can still guide you as far as you'll notice like where to pause and stay with something. But there are big differences that way. And besides, we have to be careful too that we do want to pay attention to feelings, but we don't want to make that like that's the right answer. And that's what you've got to do, because it kind of gradually comes out in different ways for different people. I hope that helps. Yeah, because we're going to see an example in just a little bit about how active listening to somebody, and that's a technique, but it can help somebody stay with their experience and notice how they're feeling about something. Even though they're talking about the situation, implicitly there's a lot of feeling that's coming out. So good question. Yeah. Here, why don't you say that last part again?
I said feelings are important, but they're only important because they tell you something about yourself, right, if you examine them.
Right.
you know, and if
They become the raw material for discernment.
for discernment, right?
Yes,
for
very, very
discovering
important.
something about yourself.
Yeah, yeah. And I have to say I once had a student in the discernment class that was just very unhappy with the whole idea that we needed to pause and examine our feelings, and we couldn't just we hear in society, just go with your gut feelings, that will be the true response. Really, haven't we all made some big mistakes when we just went with our gut feelings? We need to stop and listen and know what's really moving inside. So yes, it's the raw material for discernment. Because even if it's a bad feeling, maybe taking us away from God, we might need to tend to something there. Yeah. Okay. Well, why don't we go ahead? Thanks. Let's just go ahead here and let's look at an example of active listening as a way to help somebody stay with their experience. And this little YouTube is something that I found online, and it's for training purposes, actually, to be used in a company. So it's very short, though, and it's a good example of how a very humanistic tool of active listening can help somebody stay with their experience, and that's why it can be helpful in spiritual direction also. And it's just 2.5 minutes long. And there'll be a little bit of introduction, but then we'll get right into it.
In contrast to the roadblocks, active listening encourages the other person who has the problem to say more about it. Active listening is an empathic way of reflecting back both the words and feelings the troubled person has expressed to see if you have understood correctly. Notice the change in Rebecca now that she has learned to active listen.
Oh, nothing you want to hear about.
Oh, so sorry.
Having a good day, huh?
Yeah. You know that licensing deal I've been working with? That San Diego company?
Just a minute, I'm going to try and
Was
stop
super gung-ho about it. Thought it was going to be a good opportunity, but now I'm just not so sure.
Oh, well, it's just one of those. Oh, okay, hold on, Rebecca. You can do better than that. Remember the window.
Rush.
Okay, he's the one with the problem right now. So you were feeling really excited about it, and now you're having second thoughts?
I don't know why those subtitles.
I've done tons of these deals, and sometimes it takes a week, maybe a couple weeks, a month at the most, but this is just ridiculous.
Okay. So you're not used to having negotiations drag on like this?
Yeah. We were pretty close to signing a deal a couple times, and then they'd ask for another concession, and then we met them more than halfway. Then I get an email this morning, and they want to push back the signing until, the end of the year.
Well,
kidding me?
Yeah, it sounds like you've given them as much as you can, and now this is just too much to ask.
Yeah. I got a friend who works in the area too, and he said he's surprised that it's taken this long. Plus, he said there's other companies who'd be interested in our product.
Okay, so sorry about this. And somehow I clicked the closed captions. Now they're off. We'll go back. So sorry about that. When I tried to click on that closed caption, I just messed up. This is better than film projectors with films and sprockets and all that stuff. Any of you that are old enough to remember that, you don't know how many rolls of celluloid I messed up. This is relatively pain-free.
Listening is an empathic way of reflecting back both the words and feelings the troubled person has expressed to see if you have understood correctly. Notice the change in Rebecca now that she has learned to active listen.
Oh, nothing you want to hear about.
Not having a good day, huh?
Yeah. You know that licensing deal I've been working with? That San Diego company? Was super gung-ho about it. Thought it was going to be a good opportunity, but now I'm just not so sure.
Oh, well, it's just one of those. Oh, okay, hold on, Rebecca. You can do better than that. Remember the window. Okay, he's the one with the problem right now. So you were feeling really excited about it, and now you're having second thoughts?
Yeah, I've done tons of these deals, and sometimes it takes a week, maybe a couple weeks, a month at the most, but this is just ridiculous.
So you're not used to having negotiations drag on like this?
Yeah. We were pretty close to signing a deal a couple times, and then they'd ask for another concession, and then we met them more than halfway. But then I get an email this morning, and they want to push back the signing until, the end of the year.
Well,
kidding me?
Yeah, it sounds like you've given them as much as you can, and now this is just too much to ask.
Yeah. I got a friend who works in the area too, and he said he's surprised that it's taken this long. Plus, he said there's other companies who'd be interested in our product, so.
So you got another perspective.
Yeah, I think I've just been too focused in on trying to make this happen, and that I just lost sight of the big picture. So what I need to do is just develop more leads in the area.
Well, it sounds like you're feeling ready to move on.
Yeah, I think I am. Hey, thanks for the help.
You're welcome. And keep me posted, okay?
Yeah, will do.
I love that little
Active
smug look.
listening gives the other person a chance to express their feelings.
Okay. What I'm going to ask you to do is do a little table talk about what did Rebecca do that was so helpful for him? Because in the end, he's saying this was really helpful. She did help him stay with his experience. What did she do concretely? What did you notice? So just a little bit, share at your tables about that. And then we're going to relate this directly to a spiritual direction situation. Okay, just take a minute to finish that up. Okay, let's come back to the whole group. And are there any comments or questions about the effect of what Rebecca did? And again, a role play, and interestingly, a training video for workplaces.
This had nothing to do with what she said, but just her body language. She stopped what she was doing. She turned to him. She looked him in the eye. I was sharing that oftentimes when people talk to me, I'm in the midst of doing something else. And so I'm listening, but I'm not actively listening and looking at them and with them as they're explaining things.
And that looking, that's very interesting. It comes up often in a question in spiritual direction. Do you just look at each other's eyes the whole time? And usually the person, in her case, is looking at the one they're talking to. He was kind of all over the place because he was into his story and all that. But she did just continue to gaze on him in that way that helped so much. Yeah.
Well, she took him from being frustrated to having a plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and he came so he could accept that this is just, sometimes this happens and he's got a plan. Yeah. Rather than just hitting his head against the wall. And she didn't even tell him the plan. No, he came up with it. Yeah, by that listening. Anyone else? Okay, let's just look at, I'm just going to, in short form, show you, these are some of the just real basic active listening techniques that we talk about in the program. And I have to say, people vary, programs vary on this. I have to say, at Creighton even, I had an instructor where we did not actually work on these kinds of listening skills in class. A couple of instructors, we didn't actually work on them in class. And she said, and I asked her why we didn't, because Sister Kate and Sister Joshua certainly had us practice in different scenarios. And she said, when the time comes, the Holy Spirit will give that gift. And I think, do you send somebody over for overseas work in Africa and say they'll figure out the language just by the Holy Spirit when it's needed? No. There's a time to have it's good to have some skills, some tools that you feel comfortable with. And then, yes, the Holy Spirit, the Spirit will guide you when that needs to come up. So we do practice these things in class. And then during the practicum year, we keep going back to the idea that it can be really simple. You don't need to say very much. You could just underscore. You could literally just repeat a word or a phrase. That could be it. And it's something that you have chosen in your listening that seems to be really important. Or you could paraphrase. You might, and she did this, you could restate in simple or just a few words what they said. A little bit different language can make a difference. Or you can ask open-ended questions. But we say avoid why questions because that often gets us into our head analytical, like why do I think that way or feel that way? But more like some classic ones are say more about that, or how did it feel when, or what was it like to, kind of an open-ended question. And these ways of listening then can help them really listen to themselves better too. So what I'd like to do then is take this and move into a scenario from spiritual direction. And we're going to have 3 different parts of this young woman, Laura, and her spiritual director, Deb. And we're going to see 3 different times that there is a conversation there. And in each one is going to highlight a different way the spiritual director might companion the person. Oh, I heard this. And there was one other thing I was going to say. Sorry to... Anyway, so why don't we listen carefully and see what the spiritual director does to help bring forth Laura's experience. And these are taken from a book by Maureen Conroy called The Discerning Heart, which is full of what we call verbatims of little discussions. By the way, when you're a spiritual director, you're in supervision and you actually write up little dialogues like this to bring to other spiritual directors to help you become more free in your listening. So that's why there's this book that's just full of these, taken from but disguised from actual sessions. So here's the first one. Initially, Laura was quite hyper. I think I have a picture for this. Yeah. Laura was quite hyper, very talkative, and restless. She shared with Deb, her spiritual director, her struggle during the week to sit and pray. She said finally she was able to relax and slowly read a book by Thomas Merton, In God's Presence. Deb, the spiritual director, says, was there a particular time that was significant to you when you sat with this book in God's presence? Laura says, yes. One time I was sitting in my rocking chair. I read a little bit and then closed my eyes and sat still. Usually, even when I'm reading, I'm rushing ahead to the next thing. So you closed your eyes and you sat there. Yes, I got more relaxed and I asked God to be with me. You asked God to be with you. Yes, I did. It was like God was sitting there with me, relaxing. That sounds strange, doesn't it? Well, let's just take our time now, the spiritual director, and keep looking at God there and stay with the experience. So God sat there with you. Laura, now that I think of it, God was showing me how to relax. I became more relaxed as we were together there. You were together. Laura says, yes, we just rested together. So what do you think of that? We have examples of underscoring and paraphrasing throughout this. Was that helpful, or how was that helpful? Of course, I wouldn't bring it forward. We won't have any more negative examples of spiritual direction, but how was that helpful for Laura? Any observations on that? And you notice the director picked up on something that was already happening with Laura, with asking God to be with her, and then her saying that there was a sense that God was there. Spiritual director didn't really interject anything, but notice those important things. Well, maybe it's just a clear example, maybe, not complicated with mistakes and so on, because, of course, I think in every case, Maureen Conroy is the spiritual director in these. These are from her own experience. So what we say is that really the spiritual director is practicing what we call contemplative presence, about just being present to the directee and what their experience is, and listening with an ear where it becomes clear what could be highlighted and what could be encouraged just by listening. And so what I'd like to give is a quote that I just really love. This is from a classic article by Father Walter Burghardt, where he says that contemplation is a long, loving look at the real. Now that is really different, because sometimes we think contemplation takes you to another plane of experience, way above the world and kind of in a spiritualized mindset, sort of a changing consciousness. And he says contemplation happens right here when we are really present to what is real and is in our life, because God is there, right there. So that's behind the contemplative presence. So maybe that's enough for this first section, and now we're going to go to a couple more theological assumptions. And the first one is that God acts concretely in our world. We see that in Scripture. That's the story all the way from the Hebrew Scriptures, from the Old Testament on up through the New Testament. But God acts in very concrete ways in our world. And the communication that we receive from God, and that's part of what's concrete, is always loving and for our good. And I think this is saying we don't need to fear moving towards God's presence, because the communication, when it is communication, God is always loving and for our good. Not that we don't project a lot of very negative things onto God at times, but God's communication in itself is loving. So next one, I want to look at an example of if God acts concretely and the communication is loving and for our good. Sometimes we get hung up on the idea that spiritual direction is all about solving problems that you bring to your director, even if they know they're not supposed to fix it. You know, you come and you just want to talk about your problems. But one of the roles of a spiritual director is to savor and stay with really good stuff that happens. And we often don't do that. Like something good happens in prayer and we just go, on to the next thing, that was great. But what about lingering? Even if it's something we don't need to fix for ourselves, lingering with our experience. So here's a savoring example. So in this one, and Laura, I forgot to say last time, Laura is a young student. I think she's a student of theology, if I remember this situation. So at the next session, Laura blurted out, "I've been involved with Don for over a year. This is my first sexual relationship. Don does not understand my religious commitment. I'm not living up to my ideals for myself." She talked about her relationship with Don at length, her feelings about him, about the relationship, and about her sense of alienation from God. She mentioned that God was a light at the end of a dark tunnel. So the director says, "When you sense God at the end of the tunnel, what is God like there?" Laura's kind of slow, thinks, and then she says, "Encouraging, confident in me, disappointed. But God does not focus on my sexual involvement. He's disappointed like a loving parent because I'm not doing the best for me." The director, "Well, what does God see while looking at you?" And Laura, "I have this big, heavy lead coat around me weighing me down. I'm afraid God will take off the coat and I will be standing naked. I don't think I can do that." The director says, "Do you think you would like to take a little time now to tell God that fear? You could tell God in the quiet of your heart." And they paused for about 5 minutes. And then Laura begins to speak. "After I expressed my fear, God embraced me with the coat on, with my fears and everything else. I'm so surprised and relieved to be sharing this with you." Okay, I'd like you to share at your tables, like, what did the director do and how was it helpful to Laura? And this is an example of savoring, of staying with that experience. So what did the director do and what was the benefit for Laura? So if you could talk together. Okay, let's see if anybody has any observations or questions as a result from this part. Yeah, do you have any observations or questions related to this little example we had? And here the spiritual director was really helping her savor another way of staying with experience. Or just something that's on your mind at this moment about spiritual direction, if a question is waiting to come.
I was interested in the use of the metaphor. God is at the end of a tunnel, and that the director could have picked up various aspects, like what's in that tunnel, what's making it dark. That would have been, and maybe ended up at the same end, but the director went with, who's that God? Which strikes me as relational with God, gave that the focus. So it's interesting to see how that played out. And either way, she's savoring the experience, and I think revelations would have come.
Yeah, and that's a good point that spiritual directors are always making decisions about what they're going to highlight, and it could go this way or that way. And sometimes we can beat ourselves up about, oh, I didn't make the right choice. We lost that thread, but it'll come back later on. And also another little thing, if you were a psychologist, you might decide that you were going to do some active imagination with that tunnel and going down and so on, but that might get into some psychological material. So interesting, the decision that worked out very well that the director made.
Just following up on that, I was thinking when they talked about the tunnel, how long is that tunnel?
Oh, yeah.
Is it a short tunnel or is it really long?
Yeah. And who knows? It could. I say with the students all the time, it's so good to know that God is the real director, and that if we do something that maybe wasn't the best, which is very likely to happen, it will work out in the end. But there are also multiple ways that could work out very well. There's no one right answer. Yeah. Okay.
What we talked about was how important it is to have a spiritual director who is a good fit for you, and that the spiritual director knows what's going to work best with you. So in that instance, I felt very uncomfortable because I wouldn't want to suddenly be told, let's do this right now. We're going to do it right now. I like to think about things and process it before I do it. And so if I was with someone, hopefully the spiritual director would recognize that, or I would be comfortable enough to say that and then shift gears.
It takes real time to develop the trust and the sense of comfort, especially for the directee. And this kind of thing to say, let's take some time. Why don't you take the time you need, and it's right in front of the spiritual director. It could be really uncomfortable. I'd say that this is a relationship that's been developing over a long period of time. It wouldn't happen early on at all. That's a really, really good point. And even then, a director needs to be aware how different people are different, and often will introduce it with, what would you think? Would it be okay to take some time now, just in quiet, for you to sit with that, and that make a question? Do you want to do that now? But even to suggest that, there's already some trust developed.
It doesn't matter how long the tunnel is, because wherever you are, God will wait for you. And she gave that person time and space to figure it out on her own, which was so important.
Yeah. And and people will be different about that tunnel, how long it is, and if there's hope in it, or whatever. But the spiritual director, the most important thing is gave her time to sit and not just leave that whole scenario. Yeah.
That was kind of my thought, was not only did she give her time, but she gave her permission to sit in that. And I had the opposite reaction of you. I was like, that's what I would need, is that permission and that time to just sit with what was in the tunnel or at the end of the tunnel, or so.
Because on our own, we might not do it. Right. We're going to talk about my favorite topic, resistance, in just a moment. But you might right away say you're in prayer time and that comes up. You could find something to do and just get out of there as fast as you could. And what a blessing to be with a spiritual director who can invite you to stay with it. Yeah. Anyone else? It's okay? Okay, good. Yeah, so we will move into the last part, and I already said we're going to talk some with resistance. And we've even had a preview about resistance in this little scenario, because already Laura said, I feel like I have this heavy lead cape, and I'm afraid of God in a sense, because I don't want to take it off and just be naked. That could be seen as a kind of resistance, like I don't want to grow closer to God because I feel very unacceptable. But the director, in a very gentle way helped her overcome that, kind of overcome her resistance, which leads into the next thing. Oh, I think we can skip that one. Okay, so this is the last part, and we'll have our last 3 this time, assumptions of spiritual direction. In relationship, God takes the initiative. God always takes the initiative. And that is so good for us to realize, and it helps us. It saves us from thinking that we can we're going to make a program and it's all up to us to achieve the goals that God would have for us or something like that. And God takes the initiative in this relationship. And then the next part is our invitation is to respond to the initiative God takes in calling us into relationship. So ours is a response to this initiation on God's part. And then the final thing, and actually I've had a student that had a really hard time with this last one. So we'll see what you think. The last one is we are free to refuse the invitation. God honors our free will. I believe that's part of being made in the image of God. We can say no to the invitation. And it doesn't mean that we're just stepping right into the fires of hell or something, but we can say no to getting closer to God because God always honors our free will. And always, and I would add this, it's not like the invitation is a one-time thing and we say no and then too bad, you missed it. No, the invitation comes out again and again and again. But we are free to say no. And we all do at different times say no, and then luckily the invitation comes again. So those are the final assumptions of spiritual direction. So I think we'll just go right into a little scenario here with Laura, final one, very short, with her spiritual director. So here it is. Laura continued to deal with other aspects of her brokenness, such as how seeking acceptance from others often comes from a deep need to overcome her lack of self-acceptance. So getting acceptance from others to fill the hole of lacking self-acceptance. So Laura is speaking. Sometimes I get put out with people, but I sense God accepts this humanness of mine, even my hostility and anger. God is saying to me, you're enough. The director, you're enough. Laura, yes, I don't have to be pure and perfect to come to God. God accepts me where I am. Deb, God accepts you even with your hostility and anger. Laura, I'm seeing God wants an encounter with me. It's that embrace again. God accepts all of me, even the lead coat. Director, how does that feel that God accepts all of you? Laura, I still want to be perfect when I come to God, but I'm pushing against that, giving into a gentler invitation. An invitation for God to know me as I am. Now this time I'd like you to share at your table. I'm going to change the question a little bit. I'd like you to talk about, can you understand how that offer of friendship, of intimacy with God is scary for Laura? Because that's something that's coming out here. Does that make sense, or do you think like, well, why would somebody be afraid of friendship with God? So what do you think? How is that offer of intimacy scary for Laura? Does that make sense? Please talk together. Okay, please take a minute to wind that down. That was, sorry. I wasn't even talking right in front of it. Got too close. Sorry. Whew. Okay, now we're all awake. We'll just keep going till 12. Woohoo! No, we'll still finish early. Okay, let's see if there are anything you want to share from having talked about that. You could say that resistance or the fear of that intimacy that Laura had. Anybody want to say anything about that? and we'll talk real specifically about resistance here.
We talked about, it kind of depends on what her image of God is, or her understanding of who God is. Is God this, hands off? He's got the black book where he keeps the marks of, what's going on, or is he this merciful, loving God that walks with us? And so it kind of, the level of intimacy can depend on her understanding of who God is.
Right. Yeah, one thing we talk about in classes is the idea of our God image that we have ourselves, which can be very different than our God concept. Meaning we can have all sorts of good ideas about who God is. I mean, God is loving and merciful and all that, but the actual God who we relate to on an emotional level, we go to this default level of an angry, even very judgmental, whatever God. So often in spiritual direction, there's a gradual process of healing some God image that might have carried over from childhood or something. Yeah. And that's where I was just having an interesting conversation with Jacqueline back there. But these theological assumptions are really important because there are different ways that you can do spiritual direction. And if these are not your theological assumptions, then it could be something completely different about what a director needs to do in order maybe to help make a directee be acceptable to God. So that's where these theological assumptions are important. And I should say, it's on the slide, but I should actually say it. I plagiarized all of this material. Actually, Sister Josue did originally. But she went to a workshop with, Marianne Schofield, who was one at Mercy Center in California who really helped spiritual direction really get moving in this country. She has since passed away. But Sister Josue was at a workshop at the Mercy Center in California and took notes on this, and they're just so great. These theological assumptions are really, really helpful. And especially helpful when we look at a topic like resistance. So this is what we're looking at here. And here's a definition and then a quote from Marianne Schofield down below. Resistance is any conscious or less than conscious block that hinders a person's deepening relationship with God. So that means that there is something that is blocking that. And then underneath that, I just love this quote. Marianne Schofield said, places of resistance signal where God is active. Which means when we feel resistance, rather than going, oh, bad me, I'm not doing this right, or whatever, to realize we wouldn't be feeling resistance if we did not already sense that God is growing closer. Because if we're honest about human relationships, intimacy with other human beings is not an easy thing. Anybody who just says it's easy, I don't have a problem with vulnerability, no big deal for me, I go, huh? What? And the same with God. When we feel God is growing close initially, it's a little scary to just reveal really who we are and ease into that embrace, as we could say. So when we feel resistance, it's a sign there's grace at work. Or sometimes they say in the program, if you've read the Narnia books, Aslan is afoot. Aslan is approaching. So it's a good thing too, and actually resistance is not just something that happens in the directee. Resistance can happen in the director too. So I'm going to give you, here are some signs that resistance is happening. It could be a directee or a director. So one of the big things is if you resist staying with an important movement of the heart. Like something is happening inside and you'd rather just move on to just chatting about something or whatever. So some ways that it shows up, it might be that either the directee or the director is constantly cheery and emotionally unnuanced, especially about prayer. Like, oh, it's all wonderful. Every time I sit down to pray, it's just fantastic. Well, there's going to be differences, different kind of feeling tones at different times. Or getting routinely analytical during session. That could be either one of them. Wanting to just step back and analyze from a distance. And maybe focusing on ideas rather than on experience. Because like we said, you could have really great ideas about who God is, but your actual experience could be something that needs some healing. So those are signs of resistance. And let's see, and then specifically when we talk about a director, and I think this is really interesting, these are ways that a director might resist the directee's experience, and they could be a real barrier to being contemplatively present to the directee. They might start doing diagnosing, and these come from Sister Kate Casper. It seems your problem is that you don't have enough self-worth. You know, just outright like diagnosing like that. Or advising problem solving, they might flip into that with, I think you should tell your wife how you feel. Yeah. Or you might go teaching, you are experiencing grief right now. The way to get over grief is, and then give step 1, 2, and 3, or whatever. Or caretaking, like you just really want them to feel better, so you say, oh, don't worry about that. Think of all the good and offer the rest up to God. So let's just forget that. So this resistance shows up on both sides. But it actually is, if we pay attention, a sign that something is happening, that God is actually growing close. And to end this section, just a couple things on the interior freedom. We need to remember that God desires inner freedom for us so that we can freely choose for a deeper relationship with God, so that we can enter into what is offered in our life through relationships, whatever it is in our life, that interior freedom, instead of being pulled around by emotions and so on that take us in all sorts of different directions, but we want that freedom to be able to respond. And some of the signs that a directee is growing in freedom, they might just have, number one, just very simply an awareness of God's presence in the ordinary. They might have, number two, a growing peacefulness, tranquility after working through losses and troubles. Also, they show, number three, a contentment in being ordinary, not needing constant validation. Back to that humility. And finally, they show the ability to live and work in community, whether that means they're quiet and listening, that's one role in community, or whether they're speaking up. And by the way, this is taken from a much longer article that is just so full of deep wisdom by Sister Catherine Howard next door at the monastery. And we are selling the book Tending the Holy out here, and it is spiritual direction across traditions, so it has different perspectives on spiritual direction, all this kind of spiritual direction. But she wrote this on love and humility in the Benedictine tradition as a way of talking of doing spiritual direction in the Benedictine tradition. So let me, we go into something sort of different after this about looking what to look for in a spiritual director. So let's stop here though. Any questions or observations on this topic of resistance? Yeah.
At our table, at least I felt that we grew up with the Baltimore Catechism. And we have moved now to the 8 Beatitudes.
Oh, that is a very good way to put it. Yeah.
I think one of the issues about teaching is, and I'm tying this in with the images of God, if somebody's image is different from mine, especially if it's harsh, God is judge, I want to teach. Yeah, well, let's look at this scripture passage, or let's do blah, blah, blah. I want to change rather than stay with the person. And I think that's a tendency. I don't know if I'd call it resistance, but it is. It's probably my own resistance in terms of what am I going to do with this?
Yeah.
Rather than, I just said, I guess part of my role would be to explore that with the person, not try to change it. Just what is that experience?
Yeah. You know, and it's interesting, related to that, and I have found this helpful myself, but this comes from the Ignatian tradition. But sometimes when somebody is really caught up in a very negative sense of God and God image, to actually turn the attention away, because that usually has to do with how unacceptable they are, to turn the attention to God. There's this thing where Ignatius said, look at God looking at you. Meaning, as you sit there struggling with that sense that you just cannot be good enough, for example, and God gazes down as you struggle. What is that like? What does God see? Sometimes it's helpful, because it is hard. And that's another thing where spiritual direction is a long-term process. It takes a long time. And partly the director is modeling God's love. Yeah. Now the next part can be, I think that's fine, it can be kind of short because we've talked about some of it already, but what to look for in a spiritual director. I say a spiritual director needs to participate in the community of spiritual directors. And there is Spiritual Directors International, which I've mentioned. It is interfaith. It's everybody all over the world. So it's a very mixed group. And they've done an excellent job in writing a set of ethical guidelines, which spiritual directors, every spiritual director I know, follows. And so I'd say in a spiritual director, you want somebody who accepts those ethical guidelines and is aware of them. And some key things that are in those ethical guidelines is a spiritual director should be very conscious of healthy boundaries, and that includes non-dual relationships. For example, for me, within the School of Theology, I could never be a spiritual director for a student in the School of Theology. That would be a total crossing of boundaries, and we've got dual relationships going on. So they need to be aware of that and avoid that. They need to be in regular supervision. I'm really big on that. Of course, you are supervised when you're learning to be a spiritual director, but then afterwards, we meet monthly, usually with peer groups, where each month somebody else presents, and we help each other to become more interiorly free to listen to the people that we accompany. And that is not an optional thing with Spiritual Directors International. And the interesting thing, if somebody says they're a spiritual director and you ask them about that, you might even have somebody who doesn't understand what that means. They think supervising in the sense of somebody who's watching over you and that you're crossing your T's and dotting your I's. No, it's a process that you'd be involved in. That's really important. Keeps us honest, so we don't just put our stuff onto a directee. And then finally, they should be involved in continuing education. There are all sorts of ways we can do that. And then finally, we mentioned this before this came up. A spiritual director should be a fit for you in terms of personality and spirituality. They don't have to be the same as you, but it needs to be a fit where you can work together. And so usually when you start with somebody, it's kind of provisional for a little bit until you have a sense that this is going to work out. So, any questions on this? Because this is the very last thing. Yeah, here comes the. It's coming.
Is a spiritual director a mandated reporter?
Oh, that's a really good point. That is about as clear as mud. But I tell the students in our program, they should act as if they are mandated reporters, even though that's not absolutely clear. But see, it's really only ordained clergy in the confessional where things, and that's being shut down in some places, yeah. So yeah, no, we train them they have to report. And that's when we're talking about when there is known abuse, you hear about abuse of a child or a vulnerable adult.
Where does one find a spiritual director? Is there a place to go, or usually do you find it within your parish? Or you talked about this international organization. Is there contacts, or you go Google it, or what?
Yeah. Well, you know what? You could Google. Yeah. Google's the answer to everything. Of course, they're going to take over all our lives. But anyway, so but the Spiritual Directors International, if you do a Google and put seek and find, they have what they call a seek and find guide. So seek and find Spiritual Directors International. It's an interactive map you can click into for your part of the country, and then we'll have a listing of people. It's not an endorsement. People just put their names up there, but they tell their own religious tradition, a little bit about them, and you can contact them. And if you meet with somebody, usually the first time it's just get to know each other. Does this look like this would work at all? Kind of a little consultation that way. But also locally, you could check with Sister Josue Bainan at the monastery. And actually, if you go to the St. Benedict's Monastery website, the Spirituality Center lists her as somebody to see for that. And then there are many other places, whether it's the Benedictine Center in St. Paul or Loyola Center in St. Paul, that have spiritual directors too. And St. John's, the guest house, the Abbey guest house, yes. Yeah, it varies. Varies a lot, depending on how much is suggested, depending on the part of the country. At St. Benedict's, it's $50 an hour is the suggested amount. It's more in the Twin Cities. And part of that is for use of the facility. So for example, I pay for use of the room if I do spiritual direction over there. But always be aware, and I know this is true, I'll just say it for the Spirituality Center. If the $50 is a hindrance for you, you don't need to even ask your spiritual director that you might be thinking about seeing, but ask at the reception desk there, and they do have ways that there is help to be able to offer spiritual direction. Oh, certainly, any of those places I mentioned would be glad to get a donation that's earmarked for that. Because I think every center, whether it's Loyola or here or the Benedictine Center or the guest house, would be very glad to have that. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah.
I think you mentioned this a little bit before, but in looking at healthy boundaries, non-dual relationships, what about confession within the context of spiritual direction? I'm uncomfortable with that. I know some people like it. To me, they're two totally different relationships. So is there an accepted, what are the thoughts on that, I guess?
You know what, I'll just say the way I see it, because a spiritual director cannot offer the sacrament of reconciliation. That's a boundary thing. I mean, a spiritual director can help you prepare for the sacrament. And which reminds me of even when I taught at Cathedral High School, we would do preparation. At Lent, we'd have a time when all the students could go for reconciliation. And we'd prepare them for it, but the sacrament is actually done with a priest. So I'd keep those two things separate. Hugely helpful to get ready, though, for going to the sacrament. At the same time? Oh, yeah. That's the whole nother can of worms about clergy doing spiritual direction, because there are a lot of problems with dual relationships that can be very painful within a parish, and also whether that clergy person is actually in supervision and knows even what that whole process is. But there can be really beneficial pastoral counseling that happens with a clergy person, and then separately the sacrament of reconciliation. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Becky.